I am Richard Stanton, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful shipping magnate, I thought I had built an unbreakable legacy, but their betrayal proved otherwise. I drove 15 hours through a blinding snowstorm just to witness the birth of my first grandson. But when I finally reached the maternity ward, a wing I had personally paid to build my own son physically blocked the door. He refused to look me in the eye and muttered that his wife only wanted her real family there. He added softly, "Please do not make this harder. She never wanted you here." I left quietly that night, swallowing the ultimate humiliation to avoid causing a scene. But 3 days later, when the hospital billing department called me about a massive $25,000 discrepancy on my corporate card, my heartbreak turned to pure ice. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The biting wind of a harsh Denver winter howled relentlessly against the windshield of my heavy SUV. I had been gripping the leather steering wheel for 15 straight hours, pushing my way through a blinding, treacherous snowstorm, all the way from Chicago. The roads were slick with black ice and the visibility was practically zero for hundreds of miles. My knuckles were white, my lower back ached with the stiff, dull, unavoidable pain that comes with being a 70-year-old man, but I simply did not care. None of the physical discomfort mattered to me tonight. I was going to meet my very first grandson. The exhaustion was completely masked by a profound, overwhelming sense of anticipation. In the passenger seat beside me, resting carefully on top of my weathered leather overnight bag, was a small worn velvet box. Inside that box was a vintage gold pocket watch. It belonged to my late wife, Caroline. Before the cancer took her from me 10 years ago, she held my hand in her fragile fingers and made me swear a promise. She made me promise to give it to our first grandson on the day he was born. She wanted him to have a tangible piece of our history, a piece of the massive empire we had built together from absolute scratch. I ran a highly successful shipping logistics company back in Chicago. I had spent decades turning a single rusted freighter into a dominant fleet that controlled the Great Lakes. I gave my blood, my sweat, and my entire youth to ensure my family would never know the bitter taste of poverty. And tonight, I was finally going to look into the eyes of the next generation and pass down that legacy. The thick snow crunched heavily under my boots as I finally pulled into the hospital parking lot and stepped out into the freezing night. The icy air hit my lungs like shattered glass, taking my breath away, but my heart was racing with pure, unadulterated joy. I pulled the collar of my heavy wool coat tighter around my neck, grabbed the velvet box, and walked through the sliding glass doors of the main hospital entrance. The hospital was eerily quiet at this late hour. The sterile, unmistakable smell of medical antiseptic and freshly polished floor wax filled the air. I walked with absolute purpose toward the east wing, my heavy footsteps muted by the pristine flooring. As I stepped off the elevator onto the maternity floor, I could not help but notice the large, polished bronze plaque mounted proudly on the wall. The Stanton family maternity ward. I had personally written a 7-figure check to fund the construction of this very wing 5 years ago. It was a private charitable donation made in Caroline's memory to help mothers and children. I was not looking for a red carpet, a brass band, or a parade. I just wanted to hold my son Jason in my arms and tell him how proud I was of the man he had become. I turned the corner, my eyes scanning the room numbers. Room 412. That was the specific room the exhausted nurse at the front desk had given me. I approached the door, my chest swelling with a heavy mixture of unresolved grief for my late wife and overwhelming, unconditional love for the new life inside. I raised my hand, my fingers wrapping warmly around the cold metal of the heavy door handle. Before I could even push it downward, the door swung open violently from the inside. Jason slipped out into the hallway, moving with frantic, jerky motions. He pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind him with a sharp, muted click, ensuring there was not even a sliver of space to see inside. He stood firmly planted right in front of me, acting as a physical barricade, completely blocking my path. My 35-year-old son, the boy I had given the entire world to, looked absolutely dreadful. He looked like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. His face was entirely drained of color, his skin a sickly pale gray. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and rapid. He did not look like a proud, exhausted man who had just welcomed his first child into the world. He looked utterly and completely terrified. "Jason," I breathed out, a massive smile breaking across my weathered face as I reached forward, fully intending to pull him into a deep, emotional embrace. "Congratulations, my boy." I drove straight through the horrible storm. "Let me see him. Let me see my grandson." Jason flinched violently. He actually physically recoiled from my touch. He took a quick, desperate step backward until his shoulders hit the heavy wooden door. He kept his head bowed, his eyes darting nervously up and down the empty, silent corridor, looking anywhere but directly into my face. "Dad, you cannot be in here," he stammered. His voice was trembling so badly I could barely recognize it as his own. I froze instantly, my arms dropping slowly and heavily to my sides. The warm smile melted from my face, replaced by total confusion. I stared at him, trying desperately to process the bizarre words coming out of his mouth. "What are you talking about?" I asked, a thick, uncomfortable knot forming deep in my throat. "I came as fast as I possibly could. I drove 15 hours straight. I have your mother's pocket watch right here in my hand." Jason swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. His hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of his faded jeans, clenching and unclenching in visible distress. "You have to leave Dad right now. Madison only wants her family here right now. She requested privacy." The words hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow to the stomach. Her family. I stood there in the silent hallway of the hospital wing I had paid millions to build, holding a sacred family heirloom, being explicitly told I was not considered family. "Jason." "I am your father," I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady and low, even though a deep, dark, freezing chill was rapidly beginning to spread through my chest. "This is my grandson, my blood. I just want to step inside and see him for 5 minutes. I promise I will not get in the way. I know Madison is exhausted from the delivery. No, Dad, please." Jason looked up at me finally, and the sheer, unadulterated panic in his eyes was absolutely unmistakable. It was raw and wild. He quickly looked over his shoulder, peering nervously through the small frosted glass window of the hospital room door, as if he expected a monster to jump out. "Please do not make this harder than it already is. She is in a very fragile state. She never wanted you here. She told me she never wanted you here. If she sees you right now, it is going to ruin everything for us. You need to go back to Chicago. Just leave." I stood entirely motionless in the sterile, oppressive silence of the hallway. The golden plaque with my family name gleamed mockingly under the harsh, bright fluorescent lights just a few feet away from where I was being rejected. I looked closely at my son. I looked at the grown man whose expensive Ivy League education I had paid for in full. The man whose massive trust fund I had established to ensure his comfort. The man whose repeated professional and personal failures I had constantly cushioned with my own hard-earned money and influence. He was standing there, shaking slightly, acting like a frightened guard dog, protecting a door he was far too weak to open for his own father. I felt the sharp edges of the velvet box digging painfully into the palm of my right hand. A lifetime of sharpened business instincts, decades of reading people, breaking down liars, and analyzing hostile high-stakes negotiations suddenly flared up in the back of my mind. The blind affection of a father began to peel away. The panic burning in his eyes was definitely not the panic of an exhausted, overwhelmed new father protecting his resting wife. It was the frantic, desperate, sweat-inducing fear of a man who was hiding a massive, terrible secret. But looking at his pathetic, trembling frame, cowering against the door of a hospital room, I knew that pushing my way inside by force would only cause a horrific, ugly scene. And a newborn child, my grandson, did not deserve to have his first day on Earth tainted by shouting and chaos. "All right, Jason," I said softly. My voice was entirely devoid of the warmth, love, and excitement I had carried in with me just moments ago. "If that is what you truly want, I will go." I turned my back on my only son, gripping the velvet box tightly in my coat pocket, and walked slowly away down the long corridor. The heavy echoing silence of my footsteps marked the exact moment my heart turned from profound, loving grief into solid, unforgiving stone. 3 days passed in a haze of gray, relentless winter sky. For 72 hours, I sat in that quiet hotel room staring at my phone as it rested on the polished mahogany desk. Every time a notification chimed, my pulse would spike with the desperate, lingering hope that my son had finally found his courage. I waited for an apology. I waited for a photograph of my new grandson. I waited for a simple text message saying the medical crisis was over. But the screen remained completely devoid of Jason's name. The silence was not just an absence of communication. It was a loud, deliberate statement. It was the sound of a son choosing the comfort of his manipulative wife and her parasitic family over the father who had given him everything. By the morning of the third day, the blinding snowstorm had finally broken, leaving behind a brittle, freezing sunlight that illuminated the snow-covered streets of Denver. I stood by the window, watching the city slowly wake up, and finally accepted the bitter reality of my situation. I was not wanted. I walked over to the bed and began folding my clothes, placing them neatly into my leather overnight bag. I picked up the small velvet box containing Caroline's vintage gold pocket watch. I traced the worn edges with my thumb, feeling a profound sense of failure. I had failed to deliver her promise. I tucked the box safely into the inside pocket of my wool coat, zipped my bag closed, and prepared to head to the airport to catch a flight back to Chicago. Just as I reached for the brass door handle, my cell phone shattered the quiet atmosphere of the room. I turned around swiftly, my heart leaping into my throat. I snatched the phone from the desk, expecting to see Jason's name glowing on the screen. Instead, the caller identification displayed a local Denver number. It was City General Hospital. A sharp spike of genuine panic pierced my chest. My mind immediately raced back to the terrifying lies Jason had spun in the hallway. Despite knowing I had seen the Harpers celebrating, a dark sliver of doubt whispered that perhaps the baby really had taken a turn for the worse. Perhaps the premature lungs had failed. I swiped the screen and answered the call, my voice tight with anxiety. "This is Richard Stanton," I said quickly. "Is everything all right? Is it the baby?" "Good morning, Mr. Stanton," a polite, professional female voice replied. "I am calling from the Central Billing and Financial Services Department at City General Hospital. I apologize for the intrusion, but we are finalizing the discharge paperwork for Madison Stanton. We needed to contact you regarding the payment method on file." I exhaled a long, shaky breath, leaning heavily against the desk. It was not a medical emergency. It was just a financial technicality. For years, I had kept my corporate platinum card on file for Jason and Madison to ensure they never faced a crisis they could not afford. I assumed this was a simple administrative call to cover the standard deductibles. "Of course," I replied, my voice stabilizing into its usual authoritative tone. "You have my corporate card on record. Please go ahead and process whatever KEO payment or standard deductible is required for the delivery." "Thank you, Mr. Stanton," the representative said smoothly. "However, because the remaining balance is $25,000. Our system protocol requires direct verbal authorization from the primary cardholder before we can push the transaction through." I froze. My entire body went completely rigid. The words hung in the air, echoing in my mind. $25,000. I am a man who built a massive shipping logistics empire from nothing. I have spent 50 years looking at spreadsheets, balancing international accounts, and identifying financial discrepancies down to the very last cent. I knew exactly how premium healthcare plans functioned. Jason and Madison were fully covered under my company's top-tier executive health insurance. Even if the baby had been severely premature, even if he had required an extended stay in the neonatal intensive care unit, the maximum out-of-pocket cost would never reach a fraction of that amount. "Excuse me," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping effortlessly into the cold, commanding register I reserved for hostile boardroom negotiations. "Did you say $25,000? Are you referring to out-of-pocket medical costs for a premature infant?" There was a brief, confusing pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard as the representative reviewed the file. "Premature infant," she asked, her tone shifting to one of mild confusion. "No, sir. The delivery was completely standard. The baby is a perfectly healthy boy, born at 8.5 pounds. There was no intensive care required. The charges on this account are primarily for elective luxury upgrades and concierge services requested by the patient." The icy stone that had taken residence in my chest suddenly grew heavier, pulling me down into a dark, bottomless abyss of realization. Jason had looked me directly in the eyes, trembling in the hallway, and told me my grandson was fighting for his life. He had used the terrifying image of a fragile, suffering infant to manipulate my emotions and force me out of the building. And he had done it all while using my money to fund a private party for the very people who despised me. "I need you to generate a fully itemized invoice for this entire stay," I commanded, my words clipping through the air like sharp pieces of broken glass. "Do not process a single charge on my card. I want that document emailed to my personal address immediately." "Yes, sir. I will send it over right now," she replied nervously, clearly recognizing the dangerous shift in my demeanor. I hung up the phone and walked purposefully over to the desk. I pulled my laptop from my leather bag, flipped it open, and watched the screen glow to life. My hands were no longer shaking with grief or exhaustion. They were perfectly steady. The email arrived less than a minute later. I opened the attached document and began to read the line items, my eyes scanning the meticulous breakdown of their absolute greed. Line 1 detailed the standard delivery costs, which were entirely zeroed out by the premium insurance policy, exactly as I had expected. But the subsequent lines painted a picture of grotesque indulgence. Line 2 showed a massive charge for the Diamond Maternity Suite. It was a 5-night rental of a luxury apartment within the hospital wing, featuring a private chef, adjoining rooms for extended family and spa services. This was the room where I had witnessed Greg and Patricia Harper drinking champagne. Line 3 listed hundreds of dollars in premium catered meals, imported caviar, and expensive wine, all billed directly to my corporate account as medical necessities. But it was the fourth line item that made my blood run completely cold. It was a massive $10,000 deposit paid directly to an elite plastic surgeon. The very first charge was for a massive suite. It was listed explicitly as the Diamond Maternity Suite, billed at an exorbitant nightly rate that rivaled a penthouse at the Ritz. My eyes traced the line across the screen, calculating the total. They had booked it for 5 full nights. This was not a standard recovery room for a mother who had just undergone a traumatic, life-threatening delivery. This was an elite luxury apartment housed within the hospital walls, designed exclusively for the utmost comfort of the patient and her extended family. The itemized breakdown beneath the room charge was a masterclass in unapologetic greed. I read through the list of accumulated fees, my jaw setting tighter with every single word. There were daily charges for a private in-suite chef, catering exclusive, meals far beyond standard hospital fare. There were substantial billing codes for spa services, including deep tissue massage therapy, billed not to the recovering mother, but specifically noted for 2 secondary guests, Greg and Barbara Harper. My son had not locked me out of my grandson's life. He had stood guard at the door so his in-laws could enjoy a vacation on my dime, sipping champagne and receiving massages while I stood freezing in the hallway. I pushed away from the desk for a moment, pressing the heels of my hands against my temples. A dull, rhythmic pounding began behind my eyes. I needed to see the medical coding for the child. If Jason had lied about the suite, what else had he fabricated? I scrolled further down the comprehensive document, bypassing the ridiculous charges for imported mineral water and premium concierge requests. I found the pediatric summary. I braced myself, expecting to see the astronomical costs associated with the neonatal intensive care unit ventilators and specialized premature infant care. Instead, the billing codes were incredibly brief and entirely routine. There was absolutely no mention of a neonatal intensive care transfer. There were no charges for respiratory therapy or emergency medical interventions. The hospital had simply billed for a standard, uncomplicated postnatal evaluation. I read the attached medical summary notes at the very bottom of the page. The infant was born at full term, weighing a perfectly robust 8.5 pounds. His APGAR scores were flawless. He was breathing perfectly on his own from the very first second he entered the world. He was not struggling in an incubator. He was not fighting for his life. He was a completely healthy, beautiful baby boy. The sheer magnitude of Jason's lie washed over me, cold and suffocating. I closed my eyes and pictured my son standing in that hospital corridor. I remembered the pale, sickly look on his face, the way his hands trembled inside his pockets, the desperate crack in his voice when he told me my grandson was fighting to breathe. He had looked a grieving father, a man who had driven through a blinding blizzard to deliver a sacred family heirloom directly in the eye and fabricated a horrifying medical nightmare. He had completely weaponized the imaginary suffering of an innocent newborn child. And for what? To ensure his entitled wife and her greedy parents could monopolize the hospital wing I had paid to build completely undisturbed by my presence. The level of sociopathic manipulation required to look your own father in the eye and declare his newborn grandson critically ill, simply to avoid an uncomfortable social interaction, was far beyond my comprehension. It was a staggering level of emotional cruelty I never realized my own son was capable of executing. But the invoice was not finished with me yet. I scrolled to the very last page of the document, where a separate glaring charge sat entirely isolated from the maternity bill. It was a secondary billing code processed exclusively through the hospital's private cosmetic surgical center. A non-refundable deposit of $10,000 had been charged to my corporate platinum card the morning after the delivery. I stared at the brief description of services, my blood running, as cold as the raging snowstorm outside my window. It was not for a specialized pediatrician. It was not for postpartum counseling or necessary medical recovery. It was a preliminary deposit for an elite plastic surgeon. The description clearly stated it was for a comprehensive maternal cosmetic procedure, commonly referred to as a mommy makeover, consisting of a tummy tuck and aesthetic enhancements scheduled for the following month. Madison had literally just given birth, and within 24 hours, she and Jason had used my emergency medical card to book a completely elective, highly expensive plastic surgery. I sat alone in the quiet hotel room, the bright light of the laptop screen reflecting off my face. The profound, suffocating grief that had weighed down my tired shoulders for the past 3 days evaporated in an instant. The sorrow of a rejected grandfather vanished entirely, completely burned away by a sudden consuming wave of absolute mental clarity. For 35 years, I had been Jason's eternal safety net. I had paid for his mistakes, funded his lavish lifestyle, and tolerated Madison's subtle disrespect because I desperately wanted to keep my fragile family intact after Carolyn passed away. I had convinced myself that my son was just weak, overly eager to please a difficult wife, and merely struggling to find his true footing as a man. I had excused his cowardice as a temporary character flaw that he would eventually outgrow with maturity. But seeing this detailed invoice, seeing the cold, calculated and malicious fraud laid out in black and white, shattered every single illusion I had left. This was not the unfortunate behavior of a weak, well-meaning man making a foolish mistake. This was the precise, deliberate action of a parasite. They viewed me as nothing more than an open vault, a foolish, aging bank they could casually rob, while actively despising me. They genuinely believed I was so desperate for their affection, so terrified of losing my only remaining family, that I would simply swallow any lie they fed me and blindly pay the bills. They thought the old man was too oblivious to check the receipts, too emotionally beaten down to ever challenge their narrative. They were completely wrong. So incredibly, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. I reached deeply into the pocket of my wool coat and pulled out the small velvet box containing Caroline's watch. I placed it gently on the desk right next to the laptop. I had promised my beautiful wife to pass down our proud legacy to the next generation, but I was absolutely not going to pass it down to a family of heartless thieves and cruel manipulators. The grieving, accommodating father who had stood in that hospital corridor was dead. He had died the exact moment I read that invoice. In his place sat the ruthless shipping magnate who had built a multi-million-dollar empire with his bare hands. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady as a surgeon's, and scrolled to Jason's name in my contacts. It was time to spring the trap. It was time to let them dig their own deep graves. I held the phone listening to the rhythmic ringing. 1 ring, 2, 3. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pictured my son in that hospital corridor, remembering the fear on his face. Finally, the line clicked open. Dad, Jason answered. His voice was hushed, carrying a manufactured tone of exhaustion. Hey, I am sorry I did not call back sooner. Things are incredibly chaotic. It is a nightmare. I forced my voice to remain soft, injecting it with the vulnerability of a terrified grandfather. I understand, Jason, I said. I have been praying nonstop. Please tell me about my grandson. Is he still in the neonatal intensive care unit? Is he breathing better? Jason released a heavy sigh. He is hanging in there, Dad, he murmured, his voice cracking perfectly. His lungs are struggling and they put him on a stronger ventilator. It is terrifying. Madison is a wreck. Her blood pressure spiked again. The nurses will not let her out of bed. I sat staring at the bright laptop screen. The itemized invoice was open, displaying the flawless APGAR scores and the healthy birth weight of my supposedly critically ill grandson. I took a slow breath, letting him dig deeper. That is horrible, I whispered. Is there anything I can do to help? There was a calculated hesitation on the line. Actually, Dad. There is something, Jason said, his voice dropping to a pleading whisper. I did not want to ask this, but we are drowning. Because he was born early, the insurance is fighting us on the out-of-pocket costs for the specialized incubators. They are demanding a massive down payment, and my accounts are tapped out. I narrowed my eyes at the $10,000 deposit for Madison's cosmetic surgery. How much do you need, Jason? I asked. If you could just wire $10,000, it would cover the emergency respiratory team, he pleaded. I will pay you back. I just need to keep my son alive. The air in my hotel room turned freezing cold. The last remaining shred of paternal affection I held for my son withered and died. He was not just lying to cover up a vacation for his in-laws. He was actively trying to extort me. He was using the fictional imminent death of his healthy child to fund his wife's elective plastic surgery. $10,000, I repeated slowly, my voice losing every ounce of warmth. It dropped into a flat, glacial register. To cover the emergency respiratory team. Is that right? Yes, exactly, he replied, sounding relieved. It is for the incubators and specialized care. That is fascinating, I said, my words clipping sharply through the silence. Because I am currently looking at the fully itemized invoice from City General Hospital. The invoice the billing department emailed to me 10 minutes ago, right after they tried to run my corporate card for a remaining balance of $25,000. The line went dead silent. The dramatic sighs completely stopped. There was absolutely nothing. The sudden silence was deafening. Would you like to hear what you are actually charging to my company, Jason? I asked, my voice rising slightly, cutting like a blade. Let us start with line item 2, the Diamond Maternity Suite. 5 nights in a luxury hospital penthouse. Are they treating premature lungs with private chef services and premium caviar now? Dad. Wait, I can explain. Jason stammered. His voice was high-pitched and frantic. I did not stop. I read directly from the screen, my tone relentless and unforgiving. Line item 6. 2 deep tissue therapeutic massages. I highly doubt my newborn grandson requires a Swedish massage to help him breathe on a ventilator. But I am sure Greg and Patricia Harper are thoroughly enjoying the spa treatments I am paying for. Are they comfortable? Jason, is the champagne chilled to their liking? Dad, please listen to me. He begged, the panic setting in rapidly. There has been a massive mistake. The hospital administration must have mixed up our files. That is not our bill. It is a billing error. You know how these insurance companies operate. They just bundle codes together. Do not insult my intelligence. I snapped, my voice echoing off the walls of the hotel room. I spent 50 years reading corporate audits. I know exactly what I am looking at. You stood in that hallway, looked me in the eye, and told me my grandson was fighting for his life. You used a baby to manipulate me into leaving so you could host a luxury vacation for the people who despise me. I am telling you, it is an administrative error, Jason shouted defensively, desperately clinging to his pathetic lie. We would never do that. Then I suppose the hospital administrators also accidentally scheduled a tummy tuck for your wife, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Because the very last charge on this invoice is a non-refundable $10,000 deposit paid to the Elite Cosmetic Surgical Center. The exact amount of money you just begged me to wire you to save your son's life. Jason stopped talking. There were no more excuses about billing errors. There were no more frantic lies about mixed-up files. The absolute crushing reality of his exposure finally hit him. I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing through the phone receiver. He was completely trapped, caught in a web of deceit so vile and unforgivable that he could not even form a coherent sentence. You are a coward, Jason, I said softly. And you are a thief. You exploited my love for you, weaponizing the birth of my grandson just to steal from me. Dad, please do not do this, he finally whispered, his voice breaking into genuine, terrified sobs. Madison just wanted to feel normal after the pregnancy. Her parents just wanted to celebrate comfortably. We did not want to hurt you. We just needed the financial help, and we knew you would say no if we asked for cosmetic surgery. Please, I am your son. You were my son, I corrected him, the finality of the statement hanging heavy. As of this exact moment, you are nothing but a liability. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button terminating the call. I placed the device face down on the desk. My hands were perfectly still. My breathing was calm and measured. The profound, suffocating grief that had plagued me for 3 days was entirely gone. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive toxic weight had been surgically removed from my shoulders. The sheer audacity of his betrayal had severed the final emotional chain that bound me to his chaotic, parasitic existence. I turned my attention back to the laptop. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to my airline application. I found my first-class itinerary scheduled to depart for Chicago in 3 hours. Without a single moment of hesitation, I clicked the cancellation button. I watched the screen refresh, confirming my flight was officially voided. I picked up the hotel phone and called the front desk. The receptionist answered promptly, her voice bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to the heavy, calculating atmosphere settling inside my room. I instructed her to extend my reservation indefinitely and to upgrade my current room to the largest executive suite available on the top floor. I needed a war room. I was no longer a weary traveler waiting out a snowstorm. I was a commander preparing for a siege. Once the arrangements were confirmed, I placed my cell phone back on the desk and scrolled through my private contacts. The time for sorrow had passed. It was time to assemble the team that helped me build the Stanton empire. My first call was to Mitchell Reed. Mitchell was not just a corporate attorney. He was a legal apex predator. He had been my lead counsel for 25 years, navigating the vicious, cutthroat waters of international shipping logistics with a brilliant, entirely ruthless mind. When the line connected, I did not bother with pleasantries. Mitchell, I need you in Denver by tomorrow morning, I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Bring your entire forensic accounting team. There was a brief pause. Richard. It is nearly midnight in Chicago, Mitchell replied, though his tone immediately shifted into professional alertness. What is the situation? Are we facing a hostile takeover, something much worse, I told him. It is a domestic threat. I need you to initiate a total immediate audit of the Stanton family trust. Every single ledger, every wire transfer, every property deed, and every corporate expense account tied to Jason must be frozen and scrutinized. I heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The Stanton family trust was the financial beating heart of my legacy. When Caroline passed away, my grief had completely blinded me. In a desperate attempt to keep my son close to ensure he never felt the cold sting of loss or instability, I had handed him the keys to the kingdom. I had structured the trust to provide Jason with a massive 7-figure annual stipend, unrestricted access to our real estate portfolio, and a senior executive position within my company that required absolutely zero actual labor. I had given him the ultimate safety net, believing my unconditional generosity would foster loyalty and love. Instead, it had bred a parasitic monster. Richard, freezing the trust requires a full executive override, Mitchell cautioned. You are talking about shutting down your son's entire financial existence. If we initiate a forensic audit, any discrepancies we find will become legal liabilities. Are you absolutely certain you want to cross this line? My son looked me in the eye and lied about my newborn grandson fighting for his life in intensive care just so his wife could use my corporate card to book plastic surgery, I stated coldly. The line has not only been crossed, Mitchell, it has been completely obliterated. I want the audit started tonight. Understood, Mitchell replied, his voice hardening into the familiar, relentless tone I relied on. I will have the jet fueled. We will be at your hotel by dawn. I ended the call and immediately dialed my second number. If Mitchell was the architect of my legal defense, Victor Thorne was my weapon of absolute destruction. Victor was a retired federal investigator who now ran an elite private intelligence firm. He specialized in corporate espionage, asset tracking, and unearthing the dark, ugly secrets people desperately tried to hide. He answered on the second ring. Victor, I said, staring out the window at the freezing Denver skyline. I have a hunting assignment for you. I need you on the ground in Colorado immediately. Consider it done, Mr. Stanton, Victor replied smoothly. Who are we looking at? I gave him 2 distinct targets. First, I needed a complete aggressive investigation into City General Hospital. I wanted to know exactly which administrator or physician had authorized a $10,000 cosmetic surgery deposit on a corporate emergency medical card without verifying the primary account holder. I wanted names, direct extensions, and security footage if necessary. I was going to hold the institution entirely accountable for facilitating my son's fraud. Second, I gave Victor the names of Greg and Barbara Harper. Madison's parents had always been a thorn in my side, constantly turning their noses up at my blue-collar roots, despite happily spending the wealth those roots had produced. I wanted Victor to dig into their finances, their businesses, and their personal lives. If they were comfortable occupying a luxury maternity suite while my son lied about a dying infant, I knew they were hiding other transgressions. I wanted every dirty secret, every unpaid debt, and every hidden skeleton brought directly to my desk. Victor promised to have a preliminary dossier ready within 24 hours. I spent the rest of the night pacing the length of my new executive suite. The adrenaline coursing through my veins completely masked my physical exhaustion. I thought about the decades I had spent building my shipping company. I remembered the freezing nights on the docks, the back-breaking labor, the endless sacrifices Caroline and I had made to secure a future for our bloodline. We had built a fortress to protect our family, but I had foolishly left the gates wide open for scavengers to walk right in. I realized now that Jason's betrayal in the hospital corridor was merely the symptom of a much larger systemic disease. If he was brazen enough to charge elective plastic surgery to my company while spinning a horrific medical tragedy, there was no telling what else he had been doing in the shadows. By 8 o'clock the next morning, my hotel suite had been transformed into a fully operational command center. Mitchell and his team of forensic accountants had arrived carrying thick briefcases and encrypted laptops. Victor Thorne arrived shortly after, taking a seat in the corner with a quiet, observant intensity. The air in the room was thick with focused professional energy. I stood at the head of the large mahogany dining table looking at the men who had helped me conquer the corporate world. We begin with the primary trust accounts. I instructed, watching Mitchell spread a series of dense financial documents across the table. I want to know exactly where my money has been going for the past 5 years. Track every single withdrawal Jason has made since he married Madison. Mitchell opened his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He projected the banking ledgers onto the large television screen mounted on the wall. For years, I had deliberately avoided looking closely at Jason's spending. I had blindly signed off on his quarterly reports, trusting the boy I had raised. Now the naked truth was glaring down at me in bright, undeniable numbers. Mitchell adjusted his glasses, his expression growing grim. "Richard," he began, his voice tight. "We have only pulled the surface-level data for the past 2 hours, but the preliminary numbers are highly disturbing. Your son has not just lived extravagantly on his stipend. He has systematically liquidated secondary assets. He has sold off the real estate portfolio in Lower Manhattan." Mitchell continued, pointing at the projection screen. "He bypassed standard protocols by invoking the durable power of attorney you granted him 3 years ago when you were hospitalized. He initiated the first major transfer 1 week after marrying Madison. Since then, it has been a steady, relentless hemorrhage of capital." I stepped closer, my eyes scanning the agonizing list of unauthorized transactions. The volume of the theft was staggering. He had liquidated municipal bonds, emptied high-yield corporate accounts, and mortgaged 2 of our most valuable warehouse properties. This was not a careless heir overspending. This was a methodical, sophisticated dismantling of the Stanton family trust. Millions of dollars, the bedrock of the legacy I had broken my back to build, had simply vanished. My jaw tightened as I reviewed a cluster of wire transfers. "Where did the capital go, Mitchell?" I asked, my voice remaining deceptively calm. "You do not liquidate Tier 1 real estate to buy sports cars and watches. There has to be a destination. This money was funneled somewhere specific." Mitchell shifted the display to a complex flowchart. "You are correct," he said. "The capital was not squandered on visible luxury items or typical markers of sudden wealth. Instead, the funds were deliberately washed through offshore holding accounts before being redirected back into the United States. They were systematically wired into 3 corporate entities registered in Delaware." He highlighted 3 names: Apex Logistics Solutions, Summit Vanguard Partners, and Horizon Global Holdings. I had never heard of these organizations in my 50 years of shipping. They possessed generic, meaningless titles carefully designed to blend into the endless ocean of corporate registrations. "They are shell companies," Richard Mitchell explained, crossing his arms. "They produce no goods, offer no services, and have no physical employees. They exist solely on paper to act as a financial vacuum, absorbing the capital Jason has been bleeding from your trust. Whoever set this up knew exactly how to circumvent banking alerts. They kept individual transfers just below the threshold that would trigger a federal investigation. It is a highly professional money laundering operation occurring right under your nose." I stared at the corporate names, the icy knot in my chest hardening into solid rage. Jason did not have the intellectual capacity to engineer a multi-layered corporate washing mechanism. My son could barely balance his checking account without a wealth manager. He was incapable of executing a scheme of this magnitude alone. He needed an architect. He needed someone guiding his hand, whispering the strict instructions into his ear. From the corner of the room, Victor Thorne finally broke his silence. He stood up slowly, walked over to the mahogany table, and placed a thick folder directly in front of me. "I believe I have the missing piece of your puzzle, Mr. Stanton," the private investigator said smoothly. His dark eyes glinted with the sharp satisfaction of a successful hunt. When you asked me to look into Greg and Barbara Harper last night, Victor continued, his deep voice filling the quiet suite. I immediately flagged their primary businesses. Greg Harper runs a boutique investment firm in Denver. It has been moderately successful, but not lucrative enough to support the extreme luxury lifestyle they project on social media. They live in a gated community, drive imported vehicles, and spend half the year vacationing in Europe. Their visible income simply did not match their vast expenditures. Victor opened the folder and slid a series of official registry documents across the polished wood. So I dug a little deeper, he said. I cross-referenced the Harper's personal tax identification numbers with regional corporate registries. It took creative digging to pierce the corporate veil, but the trail is absolutely undeniable. I looked down at the documents. There, printed in black and white, were the original articles of incorporation for Apex Logistics Solutions Summit, Vanguard Partners, and Horizon Global Holdings. The primary registered agent, the sole managing director, and the exclusive financial beneficiary for all three Delaware shell companies was Greg Harper. The revelation struck me with the force of a freight train. The breath left my lungs in a sharp hiss. Greg Harper, the man who had sneered at my calloused hands at the rehearsal dinner, the man who had laughed in the hospital penthouse while my son stood in the hallway and lied to my face. He was not just an arrogant, entitled snob. He was the mastermind behind a massive criminal conspiracy to drain my life's work. I looked back up at the flowchart, and the entire sinister dynamic snapped into perfect, horrifying focus. Jason was not the mastermind. Jason was a mule. My son, the boy I had sheltered from every hardship in the world, had allowed himself to be transformed into a willing accomplice to his own family's financial destruction. He had utilized the power of attorney I had granted him out of pure trust to rob me blind, and he had handed the stolen millions directly to his father-in-law. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. The Harpers had not just married their daughter into wealth. They had orchestrated a hostile takeover of the Stanton legacy from the inside out. They had recognized Jason's weakness, his desperate need for validation, and his cowardly aversion to conflict. They had systematically isolated him, turning him against his own blood, and molded him into an unconditionally obedient pawn. But as I stood there staring at the concrete evidence of my son's ultimate betrayal, a new, deeply unsettling question began to echo in my mind. Jason was greedy and Jason was weak, but Jason was also cowardly. He was terrified of my anger. He was terrified of losing his inheritance. He knew that if I caught him stealing on this scale, I would ruin him completely. So why would he risk it? Why would he risk his entire future, his freedom and his relationship with me, just to funnel millions of dollars into Greg Harper's pockets? It was not just blind devotion to his wife. It was not just an attempt to buy the approval of his wealthy in-laws. The panic I had seen in his eyes at the hospital door, the frantic, desperate way he had lied about his newborn son, it all pointed to something much darker, much more dangerous than simple greed. The Harpers did not just have influence over my son. They had total, absolute, paralyzing control. They had severe leverage. Victor, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that caused Mitchell to stop typing immediately. Greg Harper is arrogant, but he is not stupid enough to trust a weak man like Jason with a secret of this magnitude without an insurance policy. Jason is terrified of something. The Harpers are holding something over his head. Something so catastrophic, so damaging, that my son is willing to risk a decade in federal prison just to keep them happy. I want to know what it is. I want to know exactly what secret Greg Harper is using to hold a gun to my son's head. Victor simply nodded. He did not offer any false reassurances or empty platitudes. He quietly gathered his encrypted tablet, stood up from the mahogany table, and slipped out of the hotel suite without another sound. Mitchell and his team of forensic accountants remained behind, plunging even deeper into the labyrinth of offshore accounts and falsified wire transfers. I spent the rest of the afternoon standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the Denver traffic navigate the slushy streets. My mind was a turbulent ocean of rage and sorrow. I kept picturing my son as a little boy running along the docks in Chicago, desperate to make me proud. How had that innocent child morphed into a desperate accomplice to a massive financial crime? The sheer betrayal stung, but the underlying mystery haunted me. What could possibly compel Jason to risk federal prison for a father-in-law who openly despised him? The answer arrived precisely 4 hours later. The heavy wooden door of my suite clicked open, and Victor Thorne walked back into the room. The sharp, observant intensity in his eyes had deepened into something entirely different. It was pity. He did not speak immediately. He walked directly toward the dining table, ignoring the accountants, and stopped right in front of me. In his left hand he carried a thick manila folder. He placed it carefully on the polished wood surface and slid it across the table until it rested directly under my gaze. He told me to brace myself. He said he had planted himself inside City General Hospital, utilizing his federal credentials to bypass the standard visitor restrictions, and had spent the entire afternoon observing the Stanton family maternity ward. He said the financial fraud was only a symptom of a much more devastating reality. I slowly opened the manila folder. Inside was a stack of high-resolution photographs, crisp and undeniably clear. I picked up the first image and my stomach plummeted. It was a photograph of Jason. He was not inside the luxurious diamond maternity suite I was currently paying for. He was sitting alone in a sterile, dimly lit public waiting area down the hall. He looked absolutely dreadful. He was hunched over his elbows, resting heavily on his knees, his face buried deeply in his trembling hands. The next few photos showed him attempting to sleep on a stiff, uncomfortable wooden bench in the hospital lobby, using his own winter coat as a makeshift pillow. His clothes were completely wrinkled. He looked like a discarded beggar, a man entirely banished from his own life. The boy I had raised with every conceivable privilege was currently shivering in a public hospital corridor while a fortune was being stolen in his name. I flipped to the next sequence of photographs, my hands trembling with a mixture of profound sorrow and escalating fury. These images were taken from an angle that offered a clear, unobstructed view through the partially drawn blinds of the private suite. The contrast between Jason's pathetic exile and the scene unfolding inside the room was violently sickening. The luxury apartment was bathed in warm light. Madison was sitting upright, in the massive plush hospital bed, her face glowing completely devoid of any medical distress or severe anxiety. Greg and Barbara Harper were lounging comfortably on the expensive leather sofas, laughing loudly as they spooned imported caviar onto gourmet crackers. The atmosphere was vibrant and festive, a lavish celebration funded entirely by the millions they were currently siphoning from my family trust. But there was a fourth person in the room. Standing right beside Madison's bed was a tall, heavily muscled man in a tight athletic shirt. He possessed a deeply tanned complexion and perfectly styled hair. He did not look like a medical professional. He did not look like an extended member of the Harper family. He looked entirely out of place, yet completely and comfortably at home in the center of the suite. I looked up at Victor, demanding to know the identity of the stranger intruding on my grandson's birth. Victor leaned forward, pointing a firm finger at the muscular man in the photograph. "His name is Todd," Victor explained, his voice low and steady. "He is Madison's personal fitness trainer. He works at the elite private gym she attends 5 days a week back in Chicago. According to the flight manifests I just pulled, Greg Harper personally paid for a first-class ticket to fly Todd into Denver 2 days before the baby was born." I stared at the image, trying to comprehend why a personal fitness trainer would be flown across the country to attend a childbirth. I flipped to the final set of photographs, and the ultimate crushing truth finally shattered the last remaining fragments of my heart. The pictures documented a timeline of undeniable intimacy. The first image showed Todd leaning over the hospital bed, pressing a deeply affectionate kiss to Madison's forehead, while she smiled up at him with pure adoration. The second image showed Todd presenting her with a massive, expensive bouquet of red roses, the very same flowers I had seen Jason purchasing earlier in the week. But the final photograph was the one that stopped my breathing entirely. Todd was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, his thick, muscular arms wrapped protectively around a small blue blanket. He was holding the baby. He was holding the child I had driven 15 hours through a blizzard to see. He was cradling the newborn with a look of overwhelming proprietary pride, while Madison rested her head against his broad shoulder. Greg and Barbara Harper were standing right next to them, smiling warmly at the beautiful, happy family unit. Victor's voice broke through the ringing in my ears. "He has been visiting the maternity ward 3 times a day, Mr. Stanton. The nursing staff believes he is the father." Greg Harper introduced him to the medical team as his son-in-law. They have given him full unrestricted access to the suite, the baby, and the mother. Meanwhile, Jason is intentionally barred from entering the room whenever Todd is present. The nurses were instructed by Madison to keep Jason in the hallway, under the guise of managing her extreme postpartum anxiety. They are using Jason's compliance, his desperate fear of confrontation, to keep him locked out of the room, while another man holds the child. I stared down at the glossy photograph of the muscular fitness trainer holding the newborn infant. The devastating leverage Greg Harper possessed over my son was no longer a mysterious concept. It was a cold, brutal fact. Jason was actively paying millions of dollars to hide his ultimate humiliation. The child was not my grandson. The child belonged to Todd. My cowardly son was directly funding his own replacement, financing a secret, luxurious life for his deceitful wife and her arrogant lover just to maintain the pathetic, hollow illusion of a perfect marriage. The final piece of the twisted puzzle had just fallen perfectly into place. I closed the folder slowly, my mind completely focused. The time for mourning was over. The time for destruction had arrived. The silence in the hotel room was broken only by the ticking clock. I stared down at the glossy photograph of the muscular fitness trainer holding the newborn infant. The devastating leverage Greg Harper possessed over my son was no longer a mystery. It was a cold, brutal fact. I closed the manila folder and pushed it across the mahogany table. I looked up at Victor Thorne. The private investigator was watching me intently, his posture still waiting for my directive. The anger inside me had distilled into something incredibly sharp and calm. "Victor," I said, my voice completely devoid of any tremor. "I need absolute, undeniable scientific proof. I will not walk into a war zone armed with nothing but circumstantial photographs and strong suspicions. I need DNA. I want you to secure a biological sample from that fitness trainer, and I want a matching sample from the child." Victor nodded slowly, his expression shifting into a mask of intense professional focus. "Getting a sample from Todd will require some patience," he replied, his tone low and pragmatic. "But accessing the newborn is going to be significantly more complicated. The Diamond maternity suite is highly restricted. The Harpers have locked down the entire floor with private security protocols. I cannot simply walk into the room and swab the infant's cheek without causing an immediate lockdown. I do not care what it costs," I told him. "I do not care who you have to pay, what rules you have to bend, or what lies you have to tell. You have unlimited access to my corporate accounts. Buy whatever or whoever you need to buy. I want those samples delivered to a private, expedited laboratory by this afternoon." "Consider it done, Mr. Stanton," Victor said. He grabbed his encrypted tablet, slipped it into his jacket, and walked out of the suite, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind him. For the next several hours, I paced the length of my executive suite, my mind replaying every interaction I had ever had with Jason and Madison. The sheer scale of their deceit was breathtaking. Jason was fully aware that the child was not his biological son. He was actively financing the entire illusion, paying millions from the Stanton Family Trust to hide his humiliation. He was perfectly willing to let me pass down my wife's pocket watch to a child conceived through blatant infidelity. It was a level of cowardice that bordered on the grotesque. While I waited in the agonizing silence, Victor was executing a masterclass in covert surveillance. According to the detailed report he provided later that evening, he began his operation by tracking Todd. He situated himself in the hospital cafeteria, blending seamlessly into the chaotic environment of exhausted doctors and visiting families. He watched as Todd stepped off the main elevator, wearing tight athletic clothes, looking arrogant and entirely too comfortable. Todd walked directly to the premium coffee bar, ordered a large dark roast, and paid with a credit card. Victor sat 2 tables away, his face buried in a newspaper, watching his every move. Todd sat at a small corner table, casually scrolling through his phone while he drank his coffee. He stayed for 20 minutes before standing up, dropping the half-empty cup into a nearby recycling bin, and walking back toward the elevators. The moment the elevator doors slid shut, Victor moved. He approached the bin with the casual stride of a distracted hospital patron. He quickly reached inside, retrieved the cup holding Todd's saliva, and slipped it into a sterile evidence bag hidden inside his coat. The first target was successfully secured. The second target, however, proved to be far more difficult. Victor could not simply breach the Stanton family maternity ward. The nurse's station was directly in front of the restricted double doors, and Jason was literally guarding the perimeter like a pathetic watchdog. Victor retreated to the hospital's lower maintenance levels, navigating the maze of laundry carts and industrial cleaning supplies. He needed an inside operative. He found his target sitting in the staff break room. It was a young, exhausted janitorial worker assigned to the premium East Wing. Victor approached the young man with a thick envelope containing $5,000 in untraceable cash. He did not explain the complex family dynamics. He simply presented himself as an eccentric, overly protective grandfather who needed a small favor. He handed the terrified but intrigued janitor a sterile evidence bag and gave him a very specific set of instructions. He told the young man to enter the Diamond maternity suite during his routine afternoon trash collection and retrieve a discarded pacifier, a used baby bottle, or anything containing the infant's saliva. The janitor agreed. Victor waited in the fluorescent glow of the service stairwell for 30 agonizing minutes. He listened to the distant hum of the hospital machinery, calculating his options in case the young man failed or decided to alert the security team. Finally, the heavy metal door to the stairwell creaked open. The young janitor slipped into the shadows, handing Victor the sealed plastic bag. Inside the sterile container was a small translucent green silicone pacifier, freshly discarded from the luxury suite's premium trash bin. Victor handed the young man the envelope of cash and immediately exited the building through the loading dock. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Victor had personally delivered both biological samples to a private, highly discreet genetic testing laboratory located on the outskirts of Denver. He paid an exorbitant premium fee to bypass the standard processing queue, demanding a fully expedited comprehensive paternity comparison. The laboratory technician promised to have the conclusive results generated and verified by the following evening. When Victor finally returned to my hotel suite to report his success, the sun was already beginning to set behind the jagged snow-covered peaks of the distant mountains. The sky turned a deep, bruised shade of purple, casting long, dark shadows across the polished mahogany furniture in my room. Victor poured himself a small glass of water, gave me a brief, respectful nod, and left me alone to wait. I sat in the heavy leather armchair located in the darkest corner of the room. I did not turn on the lamps. I simply stared out the large glass window at the glowing city lights of Denver, watching the tiny distant headlights of cars moving slowly through the slushy streets. The silence in the suite was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The entire Stanton legacy, 50 years of backbreaking labor, immense sacrifice, and unconditional love, was currently sitting in a centrifuge in a sterile laboratory, waiting to be scientifically dismantled. I thought about Carolyn. I thought about the freezing winters we had endured in Chicago when we were young, struggling to keep our very first shipping freighter afloat. We had built an empire from nothing, hoping to create an unbreakable dynasty. Now that mighty dynasty was effectively dead, murdered by the cowardice of our only son. I sat in the complete darkness, breathing slowly, waiting for the one phone call that would either confirm my darkest suspicions or prove that my grief had driven me mad. The heavy silence of the hotel suite pressed against my chest. I sat in the unlit corner watching the distant headlights trace through the snowy Denver streets, counting the seconds. The digital clock on the desk glowed with a harsh red light, marking the passage of time with agonizing precision. When the heavy wooden door finally clicked open, I did not startle. I simply turned my head as Victor Thorne stepped out of the brightly lit corridor and into the shadows of my room. He did not say a single word. He walked with a quiet, measured stride, crossing the plush carpet until he stood directly in front of my chair. In his gloved hand, he held a sealed tamper-proof envelope bearing the insignia of the private genetic testing laboratory. The stark white paper seemed to glow in the dim light of the suite. It was the physical manifestation of the ruin of my family, delivered in a sterile package. Victor held it out to me, his expression carefully neutral, betraying absolutely nothing of the devastating information contained inside. I reached out and took the envelope. The thick paper felt incredibly heavy, laden with the profound weight of an irreversible truth. I dismissed Victor with a silent nod, and he retreated to the adjoining room, leaving me completely alone to face the scientific reality of the absolute ruin of Jason. I did not immediately tear it open. I sat holding the envelope, taking one final, steadying breath, preparing my mind for the total destruction of everything I had spent my entire life building. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap and broke the adhesive, pulling out the dense stack of laboratory reports. The first few pages were filled with complex genetic markers, sterile medical terminology, and dense charts mapping the intricate biological sequences extracted from the coffee cup and the discarded pacifier. I bypassed the preliminary data, my eyes scanning rapidly for the final conclusive summary page. When I found it, the air in the room seemed to freeze. The numbers were printed in bold, undeniable black ink, cutting through all the lies, all the manipulation, and all the desperate fabrications my son had constructed. The probability of Jason Stanton being the biological father of the newborn infant was listed as an absolute, definitive 0%. There was no margin for error. There was no room for doubt or hopeful misinterpretation. My son possessed absolutely zero genetic connection to the child he was currently guarding in that hospital corridor. I moved my eyes down to the second comparative analysis, the one cross-referencing the biological markers of the fitness trainer. The probability of Todd being the biological father of the infant was 99.9%. It was a perfect, indisputable match. The science was utterly relentless. It stripped away the carefully curated illusion of the Harper family and laid bare the grotesque, humiliating reality of their existence. Madison had not simply made a terrible mistake. She had engaged in a reckless, calculated affair, brought a child of betrayal into the world, and expected my son to foot the bill. I lowered the laboratory report, letting the stark white pages rest on my lap. The profound, suffocating devastation that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was a very different kind of grief than the sorrow I felt when Carolyn passed away. This was a dark, twisting tragedy that entirely reframed the narrative of the betrayal of my son. I pictured Jason sleeping on that stiff wooden bench in the hospital lobby, his shoulders hunched, his face lined with premature exhaustion and fear. He was not just a greedy, entitled thief robbing the family trust fund. He was a fundamentally broken man. He was a psychological hostage, completely trapped in a toxic web woven by his wife and her predatory parents. The Harpers had systematically dismantled his sense of personal worth, isolating him from me, and twisting his cowardly nature into absolute paralyzing submission. They had convinced him that his only value was his access to the Stanton wealth. They had blackmailed him with his profound humiliation, forcing him to finance the luxurious lifestyle of the man who had replaced him in his own marriage bed. My son was throwing away his birthright, alienating his only remaining family, and risking a decade in prison, all to raise a child of another man and desperately maintain a hollow, miserable facade. The sheer magnitude of his pathetic captivity made my chest ache with a toxic mixture of pity and revulsion. But the pity did not last. I closed my eyes, waiting for the familiar stinging rush of tears that usually accompanied thoughts of my broken family. The tears never came. The well of sorrow had run completely dry. In its place, a cold, calculated, and entirely ruthless fury began to spread through my veins. The Harpers were not merely greedy opportunists looking for a ride on the Stanton family coattails. They were active predators. They had targeted the weakness of my son, exploited his desperate need for affection, and engineered a massive financial siphon that threatened to drain the empire Caroline and I had sacrificed everything to build. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought they had successfully neutralized the old man, convinced they could play me for a fool while they laughed in their luxury maternity suite dining on caviar bought with stolen money. They had mistaken my grief for weakness and my generosity for stupidity. They were entirely catastrophically wrong. I stood up from the leather chair, leaving the laboratory documents scattered across the small glass table. I walked toward the window, looking out over the frozen city. The grieving, accommodating father who had stood in the hospital hallway was dead and buried. The ruthless shipping magnate, the man who had conquered a cutthroat industry with nothing but sheer willpower and lethal instinct, had fully awakened. The Harpers had decided to hunt my family, but they were about to learn a very painful lesson. You do not try to corner a wolf and expect to walk away without losing a limb. I picked up my phone and dialed Mitchell Reed. The trap was ready to snap shut. We were going to reclaim the Stanton family trust, systematically dismantle the Harper businesses, and burn their carefully constructed financial fortress straight to the ground. I instructed Mitchell to draft the legal paperwork for asset repossession. I wanted the offshore accounts frozen. I wanted the shell companies entirely exposed and shut down. No mercy would be shown to anyone involved. I wanted Greg Harper absolutely crushed. I wanted Barbara Harper humiliated. I wanted Madison stripped of every single asset she believed she was entitled to. As for Jason, his fate remained the ultimate question. My son had made his choice, aligning himself with thieves and parasites, but he was still my flesh and blood. I would deal with his punishment personally, ensuring he truly understood the sheer magnitude of his unforgivable betrayal. The impending financial war was going to be vicious, brutal, and flawlessly executed. I watched the snow falling rapidly against the dark glass. I watched the heavy snow falling rapidly against the cold, dark glass. The laboratory report rested on the table behind me, mapping out a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. My son was a hostage, financing his own humiliation with my life savings. Knowing the genetic truth was not enough. I needed to know exactly how thoroughly the Harper family had orchestrated this nightmare. To dismantle their existence, I needed to hear their deceit. I turned from the window and looked at Victor. I walked to the desk and pulled up a corporate document on my laptop. It was the vehicle registration for the luxury sports utility vehicle Madison drove. When she demanded the car, Jason requested a company lease to avoid paying premium taxes. The vehicle was legally registered to the Stanton Shipping Corporation. I legally owned it. Victor, I said, pointing to the screen. Madison is driving a vehicle that belongs to my corporate fleet. I have full legal jurisdiction over its security and maintenance. I want a hidden microphone planted under the dashboard. I want a live audio feed established before they discharge that infant. Victor examined the details. Since the vehicle is legally corporate property, we are operating within a favorable gray area, he replied smoothly. I can have an operative bypass the locking mechanism and install an audio transmitter in under 3 minutes. I will have the vehicle wired by dawn. The following morning, the Denver sky was a freezing blue. I sat beside Victor in his surveillance van, parked across from the hospital parking garage. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the glowing screens of Victor's audio equipment. Mitchell Reed remained at the hotel, finalizing the asset seizure documents. I wore noise-canceling headphones, staring at the entrance of the garage, waiting for the performance to begin. At 11 o'clock, the heavy concrete doors of the lobby opened. Madison emerged first, wrapped in a designer coat, looking completely untouched by the fictional trauma Jason had sold to me. Todd, the fitness trainer, walked beside her carrying the newborn infant in an expensive car seat. Greg and Barbara Harper followed closely behind them, carrying bags of luxury gifts. Jason was nowhere to be seen. I later learned they had sent him to retrieve formula from a distant pharmacy, isolating him so they could travel together in comfort. Todd pressed the remote unlock button, and the headlights of the corporate vehicle flashed. They loaded the infant into the back seat. Madison climbed into the passenger side while Todd took the wheel of the vehicle my company paid for. Greg and Barbara settled into the rear seats. The moment the heavy doors slammed shut, the audio feed in my headphones crackled to life. The sound was incredibly crisp, capturing every vile word spoken within the vehicle. Well, that was certainly an exhausting performance. Madison sighed loudly, the audio transmitting her voice with sickening clarity. I cannot believe we successfully pulled that off. You were magnificent. Darling, Barbara Harper praised from the back seat, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. You played the traumatized mother perfectly. The nursing staff completely bought the anxiety routine. Keeping Jason banished to the hallway was an absolute stroke of genius. He thanked us for taking over so he could pace the corridor like a dog. Todd chuckled a deep, arrogant sound that vibrated through my headphones. He started the engine, and the vehicle pulled out of the parking garage. Your husband is entirely pathetic, Madison Todd remarked casually. I felt a slight pang of pity for him when he handed me the baby bag this morning. He literally apologized to me for being in the way. He is paying for everything, and he still treats me like I am doing him a favor. Do not waste your pity on Jason. Greg Harper interjected, his voice sharp and calculating. He is weak, but his weakness is exactly what makes this arrangement so incredibly profitable for us. He knows the truth about the child, and he is too terrified of losing his inheritance to ever breathe a word of it to his father. As long as we keep the pressure applied, he will continue to funnel the trust fund money into our holding companies. Madison laughed a cold, heartless sound that made my blood run freezing. Jason is terrified of the old man, she said, her tone laced with pure venom. He knows his father would cut him off completely if he ever found out I had a child with my personal trainer. The great Richard Stanton would rather die than pass his legacy down to a baby who does not share his precious bloodline. So Jason pays the bills to keep the secret buried. It is the perfect setup, Todd added smoothly, steering the vehicle onto the highway. We get to raise our son in pure luxury, and the old man unknowingly funds the entire operation. Jason gets to play the devoted father for the cameras, and I never have to worry about a single financial responsibility. He will be paying for the private school, the college tuition, and the trust fund for the next 18 years. It is absolute perfection. Greg Harper laughed loudly, a booming, triumphant sound. Let us just pray the old man stays oblivious in Chicago, Greg said. If he ever looked closely at the corporate ledgers, the entire house of cards would collapse. But as long as Jason keeps acting as our obedient mule, we will drain the Stanton empire dry before the old fool ever realizes he has been robbed. I sat in the cold darkness of the surveillance van, listening to the Harper family openly celebrate the destruction of my son and the theft of my legacy. I did not move a muscle. I did not make a sound. The headset pressed tightly against my ears, flooding my mind with the undeniable proof of their predatory nature. They were dismantling my family out of pure malicious greed. They viewed my grief as a financial opportunity. They viewed my son as a pathetic resource. They viewed my wealth as their playground. Victor slowly reached out and tapped a button on his console, pausing the live audio feed. He pulled his own headset down and looked at me, his expression grim and completely serious. The silence in the van was heavy and charged with dangerous energy. He knew precisely what the audio meant. I removed the noise-canceling headphones and placed them on the metal counter. My heart was beating with a slow, powerful rhythm. The sorrow that had plagued me since my wife passed away was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating machine that demanded absolute retribution. The Harpers thought they had executed the perfect crime. They believed they were untouchable, shielded by the cowardice of a broken man and the supposed ignorance of an aging father. They were about to discover the catastrophic reality of their mistake. I looked at Victor, my eyes hollow. "Take us right back to the hotel, Victor," I commanded, my voice dropping into a register that offered absolutely zero mercy. "It is time to release the hounds." Victor merged the van into traffic, but I kept my headset pressed against my ears. The shock of the betrayal had passed, replaced by a dark need to understand the depth of their depravity. I needed to hear every detail of their manipulation. The tires hummed over the slushy asphalt, but the audio feed remained crystal clear. Inside that moving car, the Harper family continued dismantling my legacy, unaware that I was riding shotgun in their nightmare. The conversation shifted, the triumphant laughter giving way to a hushed, conspiratorial tone as they navigated the icy roads back toward the hotel. Barbara Harper spoke up from the back seat, her voice laced with anxious curiosity. "I still do not understand why you had to be so brutal with your father-in-law, Madison," she asked. "You pushed Richard out of the maternity ward the second he arrived. We had Jason completely under control. We had him convinced the baby was highly unstable. Could we not have let the old man peek through the window for 2 minutes? It would have aroused less suspicion than forcing Jason to fabricate that medical emergency and banishing Richard to the hallway." Madison let out a sharp sigh. It was the sound of a predator annoyed by the ignorance of her pack. "You do not pay attention," Mother Madison replied, her tone dripping with absolute arrogance. "Letting Richard Stanton near that hospital suite was never an option. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Do you honestly think I wanted to orchestrate that respiratory failure narrative I had, to do it because Richard is not like Jason? Jason is a blind fool who believes whatever I tell him, but Richard is an analytical machine. He remembers everything." Greg Harper grunted in agreement. "The old man built a billion-dollar shipping empire by seeing the details everyone else misses," he muttered. "He is a predator. You do not let a predator walk into a room where you are hiding a massive lie." "Exactly," Madison said, her voice dropping into a venomous register. "Richard knows the Stanton family medical history perfectly. He knows that Jason has type O blood. He knows that I have type O blood. Do you know what happens when 2 people with type O blood have a child? They produce a child with type O blood. But my newborn son does not have type O blood, because Todd has type B blood. The baby has type B blood." The silence in the surveillance van was absolute, as I absorbed the sheer chilling calculation of her words. "The hospital protocol is strictly mandated," Madison continued. "They print the infant's vital statistics, including the blood type, on a bright pink card and tape it directly to the clear plastic bassinet. It is written in bold letters. If Richard had walked into that private suite, the first thing he would have done was look at his supposed grandson. He would have leaned over that bassinet, looked at that bright pink card, and seen the type B blood classification. It would have taken him 3 seconds to do the genetic math. He would have instantly realized the truth." Todd chuckled from the driver's seat, the dark sound radiating pure, arrogant amusement. "And if Richard Stanton had figured that out, he would have dragged Jason out of that hospital by his throat and frozen the family trust funds before we could even pack our bags," he added smoothly. "We had to keep him completely blind and entirely locked out until the legal paperwork was irrevocably finalized. That is why the timing was so critical." Greg Harper explained, his voice thick with predatory satisfaction. "We needed Jason isolated and completely dependent on us. We needed him so terrified of losing Madison, so paralyzed by the fake medical drama, that he would blindly sign the official state birth certificate without a single question. Once Jason's signature was firmly inked on that legal document, he voluntarily claimed paternity. It does not matter what the DNA says later. Once he signed that paper, he assumed full financial responsibility for the child. We just needed to keep Richard out of the building." I sat perfectly still, the cold air of the van biting at my skin. They had not just stolen from me. They had legally shackled my broken son to another man's child, using state law to transform him into a permanent financial hostage. But the true horror of their master plan was still yet to be fully revealed. The Harpers were not finished. So what is the actual timeline for the final phase? Todd asked, the indicator clicking softly in the background as the vehicle navigated a turn. I am getting incredibly tired of sneaking around like a secondary character in my own son's life. When do we finally drop the axe on Jason? Patience, Todd. Greg Harper commanded smoothly. We have to execute the endgame with absolute precision. We wait exactly 6 months. We let Jason transfer another $5 million from the Stanton Family Trust into our Delaware shell companies. We secure the liquid capital while he plays the happy father. Then we initiate the final sequence. Madison will stage a massive public domestic dispute in their Chicago penthouse. She will claim Jason became dangerously erratic and physically aggressive due to extreme work stress. We already have the perfect private security firm lined up to document the fabricated abuse, Madison added cheerfully. I will file an emergency restraining order and immediately sue for a highly publicized divorce. With the domestic abuse allegations firmly in place and Jason terrified of the public scandal, we will legally force him to surrender the Lincoln Park penthouse, pay an exorbitant monthly alimony, and sign over 50% of his total remaining trust fund assets just to keep the trial sealed. And once the divorce is finalized and the settlement is deposited, Greg concluded, his voice echoing with ultimate triumph, Todd officially moves into the penthouse. Jason is left with absolutely nothing, entirely bankrupt and publicly ruined, while you two raise your son in a $10 million home funded entirely by the Stanton Empire. It is the perfect, untouchable crime. The old man will be powerless to stop a legally binding divorce decree, and Jason will be paying for Todd's child for the next 18 years. The audio feed hissed gently as the vehicle pulled into the hotel driveway. I reached up and carefully removed the headset, resting it on the console. Victor stopped the surveillance van at a red light, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the snowy road ahead. The sheer, breathtaking magnitude of their evil hung heavily in the freezing air between us. They had systematically plotted the absolute financial, legal, and psychological execution of my only son. They intended to ruin his reputation, steal his inheritance, and replace him entirely, forcing him to finance his own destruction. My breathing slowed to a perfectly measured rhythm. The sorrow was gone. The shock was completely gone. Only the ruthless wolf remained. I looked out at the falling snow, mentally drafting the most brutal corporate and personal slaughter in the entire history of Chicago. The morning sun broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting a harsh, blinding glare across the snow-covered streets of Denver. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the center of my executive suite. The hotel room no longer resembled a place of rest. It was a fully operational war room. Mitchell Reed sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table, flanked by stacks of heavily redacted financial documents and encrypted hard drives. He had not slept. His tie was loosened, and his sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, but his eyes possessed the razor-sharp focus of a corporate assassin, preparing for a lethal execution. I took a seat across from him, resting my hands flat against the cool wood of the table. "Tell me you have the guillotine assembled, Mitchell," I said, my voice quiet and perfectly steady. Mitchell slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. "It is fully constructed, oiled, and ready to drop, Richard," he replied smoothly. "We have spent the last 12 hours tracing every single unauthorized wire transfer, every fraudulent corporate veil, and every hidden transaction processed through the Stanton Family Trust. We have mapped the entire anatomy of Greg Harper's theft. Now we tear it apart." He opened the portfolio, revealing dozens of legal decrees stamped with emergency judicial injunctions. "Step 1 is the absolute containment of your capital," Mitchell explained, tapping a manicured finger against the top document. "I have formally invoked the emergency fraud provisions within the original charter of the Stanton Family Trust. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the entire financial vehicle is completely frozen. Jason's primary accounts, his secondary emergency reserves, and his unlimited corporate credit lines have been entirely suspended. His access to the real estate portfolio is completely revoked. He cannot withdraw a single dollar, he cannot transfer a dime, and he cannot execute a single trade. The limitless fountain of Stanton wealth has just run completely dry. I nodded, feeling a cold rush of satisfaction. And what about his father-in-law? I asked. I want Greg Harper utterly dismantled. I want him to regret the day he ever looked at my family. Mitchell flipped to the next section of the portfolio, revealing a stack of aggressive civil litigation filings. Oh, Greg Harper is about to experience a financial apocalypse, Mitchell said, a grim smile playing on his lips. We are filing a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against him personally, as well as against Apex Logistics Solutions Summit Vanguard Partners and Horizon Global Holdings. We are charging him with coordinated wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. Mitchell paused, letting the severity of the charges hang in the heavy air. But we are not stopping at civil litigation, Richard. Because he used interstate banking channels to funnel stolen corporate assets, this elevates the situation into a major federal offense. We are simultaneously handing our entire forensic audit directly over to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By the time the ink dries on this lawsuit, federal agents will be seizing his servers, freezing his boutique investment firm, and stripping him of every liquid asset he possesses. He thought he was outsmarting a grieving father, but he has actually just signed his own federal indictment. Greg Harper will be bankrupt, disgraced, and facing decades in federal prison. I absorbed the strategy, the beautiful, merciless symmetry of the legal strike. It was flawless. It would obliterate the Harper family's arrogant facade and reduce them to the pathetic criminals they truly were. But the financial destruction of Greg Harper was only half of the battle. I turned my attention to the other architect of this nightmare. And what about Madison? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. She deliberately orchestrated a fraudulent paternity to secure an 18-year payday. I refused to let her walk away from my son with a standard divorce settlement. She does not deserve a single penny of alimony, and she certainly does not deserve half of the assets I provided for them. Mitchell produced a separate, distinct folder. He pushed it toward me, his expression perfectly stoic. We are bypassing the standard divorce protocols entirely, Richard. Because Madison actively concealed the true biological parentage of the child, and because we possess incontrovertible genetic proof of that deceit from a certified laboratory, we are filing for an absolute legal annulment based on extreme fraud. Under these specific legal parameters, Mitchell explained the marriage is essentially treated as if it never legitimately existed. The legal contract was entered into under false pretenses. Therefore, Madison is entitled to absolutely nothing. There will be no equitable division of marital assets. There will be no permanent spousal support. There will be no luxurious penthouse settlement. She will be legally evicted from the Lincoln Park residence, completely severed from the Stanton name, and left entirely empty-handed. She tried to secure a permanent lottery ticket, but she is about to walk away with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child of a fitness trainer. The trap was beautifully constructed. It was an iron cage of legal and financial ruin ready to slam shut the moment I gave the final command. But I did not want to deliver this execution through a sterile email or a courier. I wanted to look them directly in the eye. I wanted to watch their arrogant, triumphant smiles crumble into absolute terror. I wanted them to experience the exact moment their entire criminal universe collapsed. Leave the legal filings on the desk, Mitchell, I instructed, pulling my cell phone from my pocket. It is time to set the bait. We need to lure them out of their fortress. I waited for Mitchell to step back before dialing my son's number. I took a deep, steadying breath, completely burying the ruthless corporate commander and effortlessly slipping back into the role of the desperate and gullible father. The phone rang before Jason answered, his voice cautious. "Dad, is everything all right?" I sighed. "Jason, I am so incredibly sorry," I murmured, injecting manufactured remorse. "I let grief blind me yesterday. I was completely out of line. I was just terrified for my grandson. Please tell me the beautiful baby is doing better today." "He is doing much better, Dad," Jason replied, his tone immediately lightening. We are preparing to take him home. That is great news, I said warmly. I want to make things right. I have booked a private dining room at a Michelin star restaurant for tomorrow night. I want to host a massive celebration. Furthermore, I have instructed Mitchell to draft a new financial vehicle. I am establishing a $5 million trust fund exclusively for the baby, and I want to present the finalized documents to you, Madison and the Harpers, at dinner. Jason gasped loudly. $5 million, Dad, that is unbelievable. That is incredibly generous. We will absolutely be there. Thank you. I ended the call. The Harpers had eagerly taken the ultimate bait, completely sealing their doom. The following evening, the highly private dining room at the Apex Club, Denver's most exclusive and impossibly expensive Michelin-starred restaurant, was bathed in the warm golden glow of crystal chandeliers. I sat silently at the head of a long, polished oak table, watching the heavy mahogany doors swing open. The Harpers made their grand entrance radiating an aura of absolute arrogant triumph. They were dressed in a sickening, opulent display of newly acquired wealth, completely draped in exorbitant designer fabrics and glittering custom-made accessories that were entirely financed by my stolen corporate funds. Greg Harper wore a tailored Italian suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His chest puffed out with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered an empire. Barbara followed closely beside him, dripping in excessively large diamonds and clutching a rare imported leather handbag, her deeply tanned face perfectly sculpted into an expression of practiced, hollow, aristocratic grace. Then came Madison, playing the role of the exhausted, devoted mother to absolute perfection. She carried the newborn infant wrapped in a pristine cashmere blanket, her eyes wide and artificially soft as she gazed down at the child. Jason walked a few lingering paces behind them, silently carrying a massive designer diaper bag, looking completely physically drained, emotionally bankrupt, and utterly defeated. He moved like a ghost, a hollow shell of the son I had raised, entirely subjugated by the predators parading in front of him. I stood up from my chair, forcing a warm, benevolent smile onto my face. I stepped forward and embraced Jason, feeling the rigid tension in his shoulders, before turning to welcome the Harpers with the grand, expansive gesture of a forgiving patriarch. "Please come in and sit down," I said, gesturing to the plush velvet chairs arranged around the magnificent table. "I want to thank all of you for agreeing to meet with me tonight. I know the past few days have been incredibly stressful, and my behavior at the hospital was inexcusable. I was simply overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all." Greg Harper waved his hand dismissively, taking the seat directly to my right, with a magnanimous, patronizing chuckle. "Do not even worry about it, Richard," he declared loudly. "We completely understand. Emotions run high when a new life enters the world. We are just thrilled that you have come to your senses and want to be a part of this joyous occasion." I signaled to the waiting sommelier, who immediately stepped forward to pour from a bottle of vintage champagne that cost thousands of dollars. We raised our crystal glasses in a unified, entirely fraudulent toast. For the next 20 agonizing minutes, I flawlessly played the demanding role of the gracious, endlessly accommodating host to absolute perfection. I let them drink my expensive wine. I let them boast about their magnificent plans for the future. Madison spoke at length about the exclusive private academies they were already researching for the infant, while Barbara casually mentioned a sprawling vacation estate they were considering purchasing in the south of France. They were spending the $5 million trust fund before the appetizers had even left the kitchen. I nodded along, offering encouraging smiles, building their confidence up as high as it could possibly go. I wanted them to feel entirely invincible before I kicked the ladder out from beneath their feet. Just as the white-coated waiters silently entered the large room, carrying heavy silver trays of delicate, artistically plated gourmet starters, the heavy mahogany doors violently swung open for a second, totally unscripted time. The lively conversation at the table died instantly. Todd, the muscular fitness trainer, stepped into the private dining room. He wore a tight, dark designer shirt and a confident, arrogant smirk. Earlier that afternoon, Victor had utilized an untraceable encrypted phone to send Todd a highly convincing anonymous text message. The message, meticulously crafted to sound exactly like Madison claimed that the Stanton patriarch was establishing a massive trust fund and that she wanted him there to quietly share in the wealth and celebrate their victory. The reaction from the Harper family was instantaneous and entirely spectacular. Madison visibly choked on her expensive vintage champagne, her manicured hand flying rapidly to her chest in absolute paralyzing terror. Greg Harper dropped his silver fork, the metal clattering loudly against his porcelain plate. The smug, aristocratic color drained completely from Barbara's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. Only Jason remained completely still, staring blankly down at his empty porcelain plate, his jaw clenched so incredibly tightly I genuinely thought his teeth might shatter. Todd, oblivious to the catastrophic reality of his entrance, walked casually toward the table. "Madison," he said smoothly, flashing his bright, predatory smile. "You texted me to come join the celebration. I hope I am not interrupting the first course." I sat back in my chair, feigning absolute polite confusion. "Madison," I said, my voice mild and inquiring. "Who is this young man? Did you invite a guest without informing the restaurant staff?" Madison scrambled to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Her eyes darted frantically between Todd and her father, her carefully constructed facade fracturing under the sudden massive pressure. "Richard, I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice high and tight with sheer panic. "This is Todd. He is simply a very close family friend, a fitness instructor who has been helping me with my prenatal health. I have no idea why he is here. There must be some kind of ridiculous misunderstanding." Greg Harper immediately stood up, moving to block Todd from approaching the table. "Todd, this is a highly private family dinner," Greg said, his voice laced with a desperate underlying threat. "You need to leave right now. You are completely out of line." Todd stopped, his smirk faltering, as he registered the genuine terror radiating from the Harpers. "But I received a message," Todd protested, pulling his phone from his pocket. "It said to come to the Apex Club. It said the old man was handing over $5 million. The brutal, uncompromising words hung heavily in the dead air, echoing off the crystal and velvet. The absolute suffocating silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I looked at Jason. He finally raised his head, his eyes meeting mine. In that single fleeting glance, I saw the shattered remnants of his soul. He knew the charade was collapsing, yet he remained entirely paralyzed by his cowardice, unable to speak or defend himself. I slowly placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. I looked at Greg Harper, who was sweating profusely, and then at Madison, who looked as though she might faint. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply allowed the ruthless, unyielding truth to flood the room. "There is no misunderstanding, Todd," I said, my tone as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "Please pull up a chair and join us. After all, a father absolutely deserves to be present when we discuss the financial future of his biological son." Todd hesitated for a fraction of a second, his arrogant smirk faltering as his eyes darted from Madison to Greg and finally to me. The sheer authority in my voice left absolutely no room for negotiation. He slowly pulled out an empty chair beside Madison and sat down, his muscular frame looking suddenly rigid in the lavish setting of the Apex Club. The heavy silence in the highly private dining room was palpable, suffocating the Harpers as they exchanged panicked, desperate glances. Waiters in immaculate white coats drifted into the room, with practiced elegance entirely oblivious to the catastrophic tension. They silently cleared the remnants of the main course and replaced them with delicate gold-rimmed dessert plates, placing intricately spun sugar and dark chocolate creations in front of each person. The sweet aroma of vanilla and spun caramel filled the air, providing a sickeningly pleasant contrast to the absolute ruin I was about to unleash. Once the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the departing waitstaff, I remained standing at the head of the long oak table. I picked up my crystal glass, raising it slightly in the glittering light of the chandeliers. I looked at the predators gathered before me. I promised a grand toast, to celebrate the newest addition to this expanding family, I began, my voice echoing smoothly across the room. And I promised to finalize a $5 million trust fund to secure his financial future. But before we sign any binding legal documents, I believe it is absolutely essential to review the current expenditures. Transparency, after all, is the foundation of any successful partnership. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket, but I did not pull out a leather checkbook or a decorative presentation envelope. Instead, I withdrew a thick, tightly packed manila folder. I held it up for a brief moment, letting the heavy paper catch the golden light. The blood drained entirely from Greg Harper's face. Barbara shrank back into her velvet chair, clutching her imported handbag, as if it were a life preserver. Madison stared at the folder with wide, terrified eyes, her breathing growing shallow and erratic as the infant slept in her arms. Only Todd looked mildly confused, his arrogant mind struggling to process the sudden shift in the atmosphere. I opened the folder and extracted the first document. It was a brightly colored invoice printed on the premium stationery of the Diamond Maternity Suite. "Let us begin with the hospital expenses," I said casually. I tossed the crisp pages onto the center of the table. They landed directly in front of Madison, with a sharp, echoing smack. $25,000 for a 3-day stay is a remarkable sum even for premium healthcare. But upon closer inspection, I noticed that the medical procedures listed had very little to do with childbirth. The itemized billing includes a comprehensive postpartum cosmetic surgery package, premium skin treatments, and a daily luxury spa service. You authorized Jason to drain his emergency corporate reserves so you could have a mommy makeover while my son slept on a wooden bench in the public lobby. Madison opened her mouth to speak, her lips trembling violently, but no sound came out. She looked at Jason silently, pleading for him to intervene, but my son remained completely immobilized, staring blankly at his dessert spoon. "But that is merely pocket change compared to the grander scheme," I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. I reached into the folder and pulled out a massive, heavily redacted stack of financial audits. Mitchell Reed had bound the pages with a thick metal clip. The sheer weight of the document hit the polished oak table with a heavy, resounding thud. I pushed it slowly down the length of the wood until it rested directly under Greg Harper's chin. "This," I announced, looking directly into Greg's panicked eyes, "is a comprehensive forensic audit of the Stanton Family Trust over the last 18 months. It details exactly how you manipulated my son into funneling over $9 million into Delaware shell companies. It maps every fraudulent transfer to Apex Logistics Solutions, Summit Vanguard Partners, and Horizon Global Holdings. It is a brilliant, highly sophisticated embezzlement structure, Greg. Truly, it is a masterclass in corporate wire fraud." Greg turned a sickening shade of chalk white. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. "Richard, you are completely misunderstanding the nature of those investments." He stammered, his voice weak and completely stripped of its former aristocratic arrogance. "Those were legitimate corporate loans authorized by Jason. They were high-yield joint ventures designed to maximize the trust capital." "Do not insult my intelligence," I replied smoothly. "There are no joint ventures. There are no legitimate investments. There is only a parasitic siphon designed to fund your lavish lifestyle using my life savings. And unfortunately for you, Greg, using interstate banking channels to commit corporate theft is a major federal offense. By the time we finish this dessert, a team of federal agents will be systematically freezing every single asset your boutique investment firm possesses. You are entirely bankrupt, and you are going to federal prison," I stated with absolute terrifying clarity. Barbara let out a sharp, hysterical sob, burying her face in her manicured hands. Greg slumped backward in his chair, his chest heaving as the catastrophic reality of his situation finally crushed him. The arrogant empire he thought he had built was completely annihilated in a matter of seconds. But I was not finished. I turned my attention back to the center of the table, focusing my gaze on the fitness trainer who was now sitting rigidly in his chair, visibly sweating. Todd finally realized he had walked directly into an execution chamber. I reached into the manila folder one final time. I withdrew the sealed tamper-proof envelope from the private genetic testing laboratory. I did not toss it. I held it carefully, sliding it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested directly in front of Jason. My son stared at the stark white paper, as if it were a venomous snake. "I know about the extortion," I told my son, my voice softening slightly, though it offered absolutely no forgiveness. "I know they threatened to expose you. I know they convinced you that I would rather see you suffer than accept the truth. But you were wrong to hide this from me, Jason. You were a coward to let them sell your birthright to finance their lease." Jason covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking, as silent, broken sobs racked his exhausted body. The final illusion was dead. I shifted my gaze to Todd. He was staring at the genetic report, his muscular jaw clenched in absolute terror. He realized the text message was a trap. He realized the $5 million trust fund was a complete fabrication designed to pull him out of the shadows. I slowly picked up my crystal glass of vintage champagne, looking directly through Todd. "Happy birthday to your son, Todd," I said, offering a cold, mocking salute. "You will all lose absolutely everything here tonight," I promised. Jason stared at the single sheet of paper resting in front of him. His hands trembled so violently that he could barely grip the edges of the heavy stock. He read the numbers once, then twice, his chest heaving, as the absolute reality of his cowardice finally broke him. A ragged, agonizing sob tore from his throat. It was the sound of a man mourning the death of an illusion he had sacrificed his own soul to protect. He dropped his head into his hands, weeping with complete and utter abandon. Madison sprang from her chair, her manicured hands slamming flat against the polished oak table. Her face was flushed with a desperate, wild fury. "That is a lie," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the crystal chandeliers. "Those documents are completely fabricated. You paid some corrupt laboratory to print a fake genetic report because you have always hated me. You are just a bitter, lonely old man trying to destroy my marriage." "Jason, look at me. Do not believe a single word this monster is saying. It is a pathetic setup." I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and retrieved my cellular phone. I tapped a single button on the bright screen. I had already synchronized my device with the premium wireless audio system built seamlessly into the private dining room. The ambient background music instantly faded, replaced by the crisp, undeniable sound of Madison speaking from the surveillance recording captured just hours earlier. The audio feed filled the room with sickening clarity. I watched the blood drain completely from her face as her own recorded voice detailed the exact reasons why I had to be banished from the hospital corridor. She listened, paralyzed by sheer terror, as the speakers broadcast her venomous explanation about the infant possessing type B blood. The recording played on amplifying Todd, laughing about the Stanton family financing his child for the next 18 years. Then came the ultimate, devastating blow. The audio transitioned to Greg Harper laying out the meticulous master plan to stage a violent domestic dispute, frame my son for physical abuse, force, a highly publicized divorce, and steal half of the Stanton fortune to move the fitness trainer into my son's penthouse. I pressed the button again, cutting the audio feed and plunging the room back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Madison stumbled backward, her knees hitting the edge of her velvet chair. She collapsed into the seat, clutching the sleeping infant tightly to her chest, her eyes wide with a feral, trapped panic. Todd was staring at the doorway, visibly calculating his chances of physically fighting his way out of the room without facing the authorities. Greg Harper sat completely frozen, his mouth hanging open, unable to articulate a single syllable of defense against his own recorded confession. Barbara was weeping hysterically, her face buried in her arms, her heavy diamond bracelets catching the light as she trembled. "You thought you were incredibly clever," I said, my voice cutting through the sounds of Barbara weeping. You believed you could manipulate a grieving father and emotionally torture a vulnerable husband. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. You forgot exactly whose money you were spending. And now the Stanton Bank is permanently closed. I turned my gaze to Greg, leaning forward slightly to ensure he felt the absolute gravity of my words. The Stanton Family Trust is legally frozen, Greg. As of 8 o'clock this morning, a federal judge signed the emergency injunctions. You cannot access a single dime. But that is merely the beginning of your nightmare. I have officially handed Mitchell Reed's comprehensive forensic audit directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right now, as you sit here dining on caviar, federal agents are actively raiding your boutique investment firm. They are seizing your servers, they are freezing your offshore accounts, and they are preparing the federal indictments for corporate embezzlement and coordinated wire fraud. You are not going back to a luxury estate tonight. You are going to face decades in a federal penitentiary. Greg let out a low, guttural groan, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. He looked at Madison with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. And as for you, Madison, I continued, shifting my focus to my daughter-in-law, you will not be returning to the Lincoln Park penthouse. My private security team has already changed every single lock on the property, deactivated your electronic access codes, and placed your personal belongings in cardboard boxes on the service elevator loading dock. Furthermore, my legal team has already filed the paperwork for an absolute annulment based on extreme paternity fraud. There will be no divorce settlement. There will be no spousal support. There will be absolutely no equitable division of assets. You attempted to use the legal system to extort my family, so I am using the legal system to leave you with absolutely nothing. You and Todd can figure out how to finance your own lives on a gym trainer's salary. I did not wait for her to respond. I walked around the massive oak table until I stood directly behind Jason. My son was still hunched over his face, buried in his hands, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of the destruction happening around him. He had lost everything he thought he wanted, but I was not going to let him lose his life to these predators. I reached down and gripped Jason firmly by the shoulder. I pulled him upward, forcing him to stand on his feet. He swayed slightly, his eyes red and vacant, but he did not resist my grip. You are leaving with me, Jason, I told him, my voice firm, but carrying a trace of the protective father I had always been. We are walking out of this room, and you are never looking back at these parasites again. You have a tremendous amount of answering to do for your cowardice, but you will do it within the walls of our own home. I kept my hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the heavy doors. Before I opened them, I stopped and turned back to face the ruined family. Todd was already inching away from Madison, eager to distance himself from the sinking ship. Greg was aggressively pointing a trembling finger at his daughter, violently blaming her for the entire collapse of his financial empire. If any of you ever attempt to contact my son again, I promised, my voice echoing with a lethal, absolute certainty, I will unleash a wave of litigation so massive that I will bury you so deep in legal fees, your grandchildren will be paying them. I opened the doors and guided Jason out into the quiet corridor. Behind us, the dining room erupted into chaos. Greg screamed hoarsely. Barbara wailed as glass shattered. They were tearing each other apart like starving wolves. I did not look back at them. We had a powerful family legacy to safely rebuild together from the very bottom, ashes today. The flight back to Chicago was a quiet journey marked by a profound sense of transition. The freezing winds of Denver were left behind, replaced by the familiar skyline of my own city. The weeks that immediately followed our return were an intensive period of reconstruction. I moved Jason back into the family estate, installing him in the vast, quiet wing of the house where he had grown up. He was entirely shattered, a hollow shell of a man who had spent the last 2 years living in a state of constant, paralyzing terror. But for the first time in a very long time, he was finally safe. The healing process was not instantaneous. We hired a team of elite psychological professionals who specialized in severe emotional trauma and coercive control. Jason entered intensive therapy, attending grueling daily sessions to systematically dismantle the toxic programming the Harper family had forced upon him. It was incredibly painful to watch my son confront the sheer depth of his own cowardice and manipulation. There were days when he could not leave his room, drowning in the crushing guilt of nearly throwing away his birthright for a fabricated child. But slowly, the fog began to lift. He started to recognize the psychological chains that had bound him. He began to understand that he was not inherently weak, but rather a victim of highly calculated predatory abuse. Simultaneously, Mitchell Reed executed the legal strategy with the precision of a master surgeon. The petition for an absolute annulment moved through the judicial system with incredible speed, entirely propelled by the undeniable scientific proof of extreme paternity fraud. Madison attempted to contest the filing, hiring a desperate bottom-tier lawyer to demand spousal support and a division of the corporate assets. Mitchell crushed her pathetic defense in a single afternoon. He presented the audio recordings, the financial audits, and the genetic laboratory reports to the presiding judge. The judge was so profoundly disgusted by the sheer scale of the deceit that he granted the annulment immediately. The marriage was legally erased, classified as a fraudulent contract entered into under deliberately false pretenses. Madison Stanton ceased to exist. She was legally stripped of our family name and permanently barred from ever claiming a single asset from the Stanton family trust. Jason was completely legally emancipated from his parasite. While my son healed and the annulment was finalized, the federal authorities descended upon Greg Harper with absolute unrelenting fury. The forensic audit we provided to the Financial Crimes Division was so meticulously detailed that the federal agents barely had to conduct their own investigation. They raided his boutique investment firm at dawn, dragging Greg out of his opulent glass office in handcuffs, as local news cameras captured the entire humiliating spectacle. The charges were staggering. He was indicted on multiple counts of corporate embezzlement, systemic wire fraud, and grand larceny. The millions he had siphoned from my son were seized by the federal government, completely liquidating his company and stripping him of all his personal assets. Barbara Harper, facing the sudden reality of absolute poverty and a husband heading to federal prison, suffered a massive social breakdown. She was forced to abandon her country club memberships, sell her excessive diamond jewelry to pay for basic living expenses, and move out of her sprawling luxury estate before the bank foreclosed on the property. The aristocratic facade they had wielded like a weapon was entirely obliterated, leaving them as the ultimate social pariahs of their wealthy circle. As for Madison and Todd, their brilliant master plan devolved into a miserable, claustrophobic nightmare. Without the limitless fountain of the Stanton family wealth to finance their luxurious lifestyle, the grim reality of their situation crashed down upon them. They were forced to rent a cramped, poorly insulated two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. Todd, whose only marketable skill was lifting weights, had to take on exhausting double shifts at a low-end commercial gym just to pay for basic utilities and infant formula. Madison, who had grown accustomed to private chefs and luxury maternity spas, found herself completely isolated and drowning in the crushing responsibilities of motherhood without a single nanny or assistant to help her. But the true punishment was the relentless wave of litigation I unleashed upon them. True to my word, I filed an avalanche of civil lawsuits against both of them for deliberate fraud, emotional distress, and financial extortion. The lawsuits were designed to be incredibly complex and exceptionally expensive to defend. They were forced to spend every single dollar they managed to scrape together on desperate legal representation, trapping them in a permanent, suffocating cycle of crippling debt. The financial prison they had planned for my son was now their permanent reality. I stood quietly in my executive office on the top floor of the Stanton corporate tower, holding a steaming cup of dark roast coffee. The morning sun illuminated the vast, sprawling expanse of the Chicago skyline, casting long, golden shadows across the busy streets far below. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settle into my chest. The agonizing sorrow that had shadowed my life since Caroline passed away was finally gone. In its place was a sharp, unyielding clarity. I had spent years believing that unconditional love meant providing endless comfort and limitless resources. I had believed that shielding my family from hardship was the ultimate duty of a father. But that blind, accommodating love had nearly cost me my son and my entire legacy. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked at the polished mahogany desk where I had spent decades building my empire. I realized now that true power is not just about accumulating massive wealth or commanding vast corporate fleets. True power is the absolute willingness to protect what you have built from those who seek to exploit it, even when those predators are sitting at your own dinner table. It is the courage to set unbreakable boundaries and the strength to enforce catastrophic consequences when those boundaries are crossed. The Harpers had seen a grieving widower and a vulnerable son, and they had arrogantly assumed we were easy prey. They forgot that the Stanton Empire was forged in fire and steel, built by a man who understood how to survive the most brutal storms. I had not lost my legacy to their venomous greed. I had successfully purged the rot from its very foundation. Jason was currently sitting in the office down the hall, reviewing shipping manifests, slowly but surely, learning how to lead with genuine strength and unwavering integrity. He had a very long road ahead of him, but he was finally walking it as a free, awakened man. I took a final sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, complex flavor. My family was completely healed. The formidable corporate empire I built was permanently secured against all external threats. The ruthless wolf had successfully protected his vulnerable pack from the circling scavengers, effectively ensuring our survival. Looking out at the radiant morning sky, I knew the majestic, enduring future belonged entirely to us now and forever. The hardest lesson a parent can learn is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional access to your entire life work. When you sacrifice your own boundaries to appease manipulative people, you are not protecting your family. You are feeding the predators that seek to destroy it. Family is not defined by blood or marriage certificates. It is defined by respect, loyalty, and truth. Never let the fear of being alone strip you of your dignity. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is to burn their toxic world down so they can learn to rebuild. If the story of Richard struck a chord with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice and absolute truth. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your experiences in the comments down below. Support each other today.